Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy, and I'm joining you hot foot from all the party conferences. Just one to go, the SNP conference, and it's fair to say that whilst democracy was discussed to a greater or lesser extent at the conferences, certainly I think what Peter is about to talk to us about didn't feature, I'm afraid to say, and I think that is perhaps one of the frustrations that Peter Emerson has. So the agenda for tonight, I will do a brief introduction of Peter Emerson. Then Peter is going to speak for about 10 minutes and display some slides to explain the voting system that he advocates. Then there'll be a couple of questions from me. But then once things have got going, we will hand it over to the audience for questions. So please do make sure that you put your questions into the Q&A section if you want to ask Peter a question. So Peter Emerson is the director of the De Border Institute in Northern Ireland, and he's also a cyclist, I noted. So we share democracy and cycling as a passion. For those of you who don't know, the De Border Institute aims to promote the use of inclusive voting procedures on all contentious questions of social choice, applies specifically to decision-making, be it for the electorate in regional national polls, for their elected representatives in councils and parliaments, for members of a local community group, for members of a company board, for members of a cooperative, and so on. So in other words, a very extensive use potentially. Peter is the author of a number of books, Majority Voting as a Catalyst of Populism and Democratic Decision Making, and tonight's book, which this is the book launch of, The Punter's Guide to Democracy. And I'll just finish by saying, before handing over to Peter, that I know that Peter is incredibly passionate about his subject and the weaknesses and drawbacks of simple binary yes-no voting systems. So without any further ado, Peter, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. I start with a story of war, not of some horrible battle or atrocity, but of, well, life goes on and food still has to be cooked and clothes have to be washed and children still like to play. And one day, in a little village in Bosnia, a little boy went to the woods where he'd been many times before. But what he hadn't realized was that a battle not far away had meant that the front lines were redrawn and the woods now belonged to the other side. And as you can see from this map, there were front lines all over the place, the white lines. And he was found by soldiers of the other side. What's your name, boy? Ante. Ante what? Ante Ducic. And the father's name was Noah. And so they realized where he was from and all that. So they took him back to the front line and then shouted across, Novak Ducic. And of course, there was no reply. Novak Ducic, we have your son. Again, a pause. Let him speak. So they brought the little boy up to the front line. Papa, yes, Sam, it's me. So it was genuine and they arranged a ceasefire and the little boy was reunited with his dad and they went home. And Mum cooked a few of his favorite special cakes. And they then went back to the front line, had another ceasefire and shared the cakes with the enemy. And it's a bit like that story of the football match in the First World War between British and German soldiers on the no man's land. And the war, like World War I, the war in Bosnia should never have been fought. But it was fought, and partly because, there were many reasons, but partly because in 1991, there was an election. And this can happen especially with election systems that allow the voter to only cast one preference. And what had been the secular state of Bosnia in Yugoslavia was now divided into three. And most of the parties were sectarian. And so it finished up with 40, 30, 20, Muslim, Orthodox, Catholic. So any two could combine against the other one. And for some reason, the European Union, or European Community as it was, insisted on a referendum. And Radovan Karadzic, the leader of the Bosnian Serbs, he had said that if there is to be a referendum, that there will be war. And he organized a boycott. The Bosnian Serbs boycotted, just like the Catholics in Northern Ireland boycotted the border poll in 1973, just like the Catholics in the Krajina in Croatia boycotted in 91, just like the Orthodox in Croatia also in 91, just like the Georgians in Abkhazia in 99. And so it goes on. Do we ever learn? Referendums, well, sometimes I suppose they're okay, like the Belfast Agreement, but I, for one, would have preferred to vote for an agreement that didn't have designations. Or you could say that, well, maybe multi-option voting might be good. And the British government did organize a multi-option vote in 1948 for Newfoundland. They had three options. But most referendums are binary, and most binary votes are divisive. And all the wars in the former Yugoslavia started with a referendum, as from Oslo, Virginia. And we have now seen exactly the same situation happen in Crimea, in Ukraine, with 2014 referendums in Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk. And 2014, of course, was also the year of the Scottish referendum, and the word Scotland, Shotlandia, was used in Luhansk by Russian separatists to justify the unjustifiable. So I want to question whether or not the democratic process should allow one individual, Putin or Cameron or Johnson or whoever, to just concoct a question and demand a vote and assume that the outcome is a democratic will. And let us take an example of three people in England a few years ago who didn't like the fact that the UK was in the EU, the then status quo. And they all agreed that they didn't like it very much, but they did not agree as to what might be better. And Miss I wanted the UK to be in the EEC, but Mr. J thought the customs union would be better, and Miss K preferred no deal, or WTO. So they had their differences, which can be called preferences. And if you take a majority vote, just option X, yes or no, then, well, there's a majority of 2 against 1 against B, and a C and D, and a 3-0 against A. So there's a majority against everything. So that's no good. So if you take a different sort of majority vote, a pairing as it's called, then you see that A is more popular than B by 2 to 1, and B is more popular than C by 2 to 1, and C and A is more popular than B is more popular than C is more popular than D, and you go round and round in circles forever. And this is the well-known paradox of binary voting. And difficulties like this have been known since the ancient Greeks, actually, some of them. So they invented rules, procedures, and we're still following them today for some extraordinary reason. And if you have a status quo A, which people don't like very much, then somebody might suggest a better idea. Well, they think it's a better idea, and so they call it option B. And if others disagree, then they can say, well, they can propose amendments, and we'll take C and D. So it's a very simple scenario. And the rules are that the first thing you do is choose the preferred amendment, and then you can adopt or reject this amendment to get what they call the substantive, and then you make the final decision, the substantive or the status quo. So it's 3 binary votes, all perfectly simple, and so the situation we have here is that we have the 2 amendments, C and D, so we'll see which one of those is better with 1 majority vote, then the winner against B, and then the winner against A, and there's the outcome. And sure enough, here we go. So C is more popular than D by 2 to 1, so then C versus B, and B is more popular than C by 2 to 1. So then it's B versus A, and A is more popular than B by 2 to 1. So the answer is A. So having agreed initially that they did not like A, they then agree democratically that they do like A. So the answer is wrong. And binary voting is sometimes hopelessly inaccurate. It's worse than that, because if C is the motion, while B and D are the amendments, then it goes like this, and D is more popular than B, so then it's D versus C, and then C versus, and the answer is C. Or if D were the motion and B and C were the amendments, the outcome would be D. So basically, it means that whoever's the person in charge, they just arrange the debate and get whatever they want. And when Theresa May was talking about Brexit, she had her indicative votes, which indicated nothing because she relied on majority votes, and there was a majority against everything. Boris Johnson then decided that his deal would be the answer. But it wasn't a question of his deal, yes or no, alongside lots of other deals, perhaps or not. It was, he worded it in such a way that it was read by everybody as either his deal or no deal. And no deal, of course, was the most unpopular option of all. So anything would have beaten no deal. So the fact that his option beat no deal meant next to nothing. Maybe it would be better to do things in a more pluralist way and to allow for plurality to exist, for lots of options to exist. And I've chosen a different voters profile here with 14 voters. And there are lots of electoral systems in the world, and there are quite a few voting procedures which can be used in decision-making as well. Not as many, because with elections, you might be electing more than one person and it might be proportional and all that sort of thing. But with decision-making, well, there's only one decision that you have to make, or one prioritization or whatever. So I've taken just 4 of the systems, and with this particular voters profile, well, the answer, the outcome will be either W, X, or Y, or Z, which means that the manipulating politician can again manipulate everything by just choosing the voting procedure that will give him or her the answer that they want, if they know the voter's profile, or have a pretty good guess as to what it was. Now, of these systems here, the modified border count is the only one that always takes all preferences cast by all voters into account, always. And it is, for that reason, if nothing else, I would argue, very accurate. And the social ranking in this particular case is ZYXW. And it's interesting, to put it mildly, to note that it is the exact opposite of the social ranking that you get with plurality voting, WXYZ. So plurality voting is wrong and couldn't be more wrong. So I'd like you to read the book instead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. So, I mean, what you've just described may require a bit more explanation as we get into questions. So, but I wanted to start by asking you a question about, clearly you are very, very passionate about the need to adopt a voting system that actually does draw out people's preferences, and the result reflects those, rather than systems that can be in effect loaded by the person in charge to just come up with the answer that they think is the right one. So where did your passion or interest in this come from?
I suppose the simple answer to that question is that my father was an Irish Protestant from Cork, as it happened, and my mother was an English Catholic from Cheshire. So I am a political bastard, I suppose you could say. And I came to Northern Ireland in 1975, partly because I knew the problem existed, but I knew I didn't understand the problem in any depth at all. And I came from Africa. I'd been working out in Africa for a few years, and Africa has got a different tradition about decision making, and they believed in consensus, and they would talk and talk and talk, usually under the shade of a tree, and this was Nyerere or the Gachachas in Rwanda or wherever. But they were much more patient, whereas the European, the Wazungu, they wanted to get a decision, and so sometimes they would insist on majority voting. But looking back, was it a good idea to insist on majority voting and majority rule in Rwanda? So, and then when I came here, I realized that, well, majority rule doesn't work here very well either. And then it doesn't work well in Bosnia or anywhere. And just as I've been looking at this and living through it, it just becomes more and more obvious that the humankind has made a serious mistake in thinking that decision-making by majority vote is sort of okay. And it really is incredible how majority voting, well, the word in Russian is Bolshinstvo, and the Bolshevik was a member of the majority. It's the same thing, and look at the disaster that was. And majority voting is written into the Constitution of North Korea, and it's being used by the Chinese Communist Party Standing Committee and so on. It's universal, and it really is no good.
Okay, one question about the alternatives that you put forward is how the public would take to a system like that. I mean, one of the arguments that's put against STV, for instance, is that, oh, it's very complicated, people won't understand it, and there'll be lots of spoiled ballot papers. So what experience have you got of how, when the systems that you advocate are adopted, how is there a need to educate the voters about the system beforehand, or do people take to it like a duck to water?
The interesting situation in Newfoundland, the one I mentioned in 1948, and that was a case where the Westminster government proposed a referendum, or they proposed two options, and there were then protests on the streets of Halifax and said, oh, for God's sake, we want a third option. So it was a question of educating the drafters of the referendum rather than the public. And so a third option was added, and sure enough, in the two-round system, it won. But another very good example of this is what happened in New Zealand in 1992. And they wanted to reform their electoral system because their first past the post system was seen to be no good, just as our system is seen to be no good. So they set up an independent commission. And the independent commission had a look at everything. And it's probably fair to say that in 1991, there weren't very many New Zealanders who understood the acronym AMS. But they had this commission, and it took readings and issued statements, and there was a huge process that went on, which in effect educated the New Zealand public. And so by the time the vote came, and they had 5 options, one was the status quo, first past the post, and the other was the PRSTV, the Irish system, well, but it's now in Scotland as well, of course. And then they had 3 other options in the middle. One was AMS, one was MMP, and there probably weren't many people in 91 who knew what MMP was either. And the other one was, oh, I've forgotten now, AV. So the whole education process is so necessary. And you have because it's a public independent commission, and so during its sittings, it was an education process. And as I say, by the time the vote came around, people were fully aware and the turnout was pretty good. And sure enough, the other thing that is interesting to note is that the answer was a compromise. And if you have more than two options, you might get a compromise as an answer. But if you only have two options, then there's no hope at all. So that is the process that I would argue should be followed. But the important thing is that the choice of options must be independent of the political leader, whether it's Putin or Cameron or Johnson or whomsoever. You have a totally independent situation, and they can produce a short list, normally of about, well, we would argue between 4 and 6 options, and then the people are perfectly capable of doing it. And there's another interesting case, or am I talking too much? Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll leave it there.
We've had a request, which I think I should have perhaps said at the outset, and that is, as far as possible, not to use TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. So STV, AMS, and actually spell them out for people. I think that, as far as possible, I think that would help. So we are starting to get questions in, I'm pleased to say. And something that I was thinking of, and GT has asked this question, and that is, why not do away with elections altogether and set up citizens' assemblies based on sortition to determine and decide policy? Is this naive? ?
I'm fully in favor of citizens' assemblies. I think they are an additional, not to replace, but something to use in addition to. And the interesting situation here in Ireland is that the Citizens' Assembly, the most recent one, recommended that in future referendums should be multi-optional. And they also, in their own deliberations, they used multi-option voting. It's quite interesting, this, in their terms of reference, the Irish Parliament said that they should take decisions by majority vote, but they were tackling problems like abortion, and you can't say that's only yes or no. Like so many other things, there are umpteen options, and so they used multi-option voting, but they didn't actually sort of describe it as such, and they pretended that it was still a majority vote. But never mind, they used it and it worked quite well. And as I say, they have recommended multi-option voting for future referendums.
Okay, we've got some questions about other voting systems. So, for instance, Martin Blake asking, how reliable or proportionate is STV? Is that something you'd like to tackle, Peter?
Okay, but I mean, STV is when it is PR STV, it's pretty good. And we have it here in Northern Ireland, as you know. But it does have, it's not perfect. And I know this from personal experience because I've stood as a candidate in 15 different elections and I failed them all. But if you are the second preference of everybody, but the first preference of none, then you are eliminated probably at a very early stage, and that's it. So there is an even better system, which is called the quota border system, which was invented by Sir Michael Dummett, the late. And that ensures that all preferences cast are taken into account. But STV is nevertheless, it's probably the best electoral system in current use anywhere in the world. The other good system is the Swiss system, which is a PR list, but that too allows people to vote across party and across gender and even across the sectarian divide. But STV as a decision-making system is when it's called AV then. And AV, it can be an electoral system as it is in Australia, or for decision-making, But you can't have PRSTV in decision making, of course, because you can't have PR in decisions. But AV then it can be a bit capricious, to be quite honest. And again, like in the example that I showed you, it means that the option that is everybody's second preference might not get enough first preferences to get into the second round. Whereas with the modified border count, then everything gets into there's only one round and you count everything all in one go. It's much easier to understand as well, actually. So STV, yeah, as an electoral system, PRSTV is very good, but it's not the best. And AV, STV without the PR is not as good, and it can, as I say, it can be capricious.
So STV, transferable vote, and AV, alternative vote. Am I right in saying that the alternative vote in some circumstances can be even more disproportionate than first past the post? So those who are advocating AV as a proportional system are incorrect, because there are circumstances in which it is anything but proportional.
Yes, AV is not proportional. It works in single seat constituencies, and you might get anomalies just as you do with first past the post.
Sure.
The nice thing about AV is that it does encourage a little bit of cross-party cooperation. There's another interesting story about Papua New Guinea, because with first past the post, you only need a majority to get elected, and you might just be the largest minority. If there are 3 candidates, if you get 34% and the other 2 get only 33, then you get elected. And if there are 20 candidates and everybody is getting about 4% and you get 5%, then you're in. And this happened in Papua New Guinea. So they then realized, okay, well, we better change this terrible little first past the post. And the good people of Papua New Guinea then decided to adopt the alternative vote, but they made a proviso, and that is that anybody voting votes for at least 3 candidates. Now, most of the candidates in Papua New Guinea were based on a tribal origin, so there was a lot of tribalism. But by having this stipulation that you have to cast at least 3 preferences for your vote to be valid, then it did an awful lot to break down tribalism. Hasn't solved everything, of course, but it's at least a good attempt.
Excellent. Just so that people know, Grace has put into the chat a document that sets out a description of all of the different voting systems that we're talking about, in case people want to have a look at that later. Sarah Vaughan has asked a question about the Italian PR system leading to instability. I mean, is it in fact their choice of PR system that has led to instability, or is it just Italian politics that is prone to instability? What's your view, Peter?
The Italians have proportional representation, supposedly. But then when they have, after any election, if they have problems sorting out a government, they give the winning party, even if it's only the largest minority and not a majority at all, they give the largest minority a bonus of 50 seats, which means that, of course, that the voting system is not proportional anymore. One of the extraordinary situations on this argument applies to Germany as well. And there are many people after the war who thought that the reason why the Weimar Republic and all that sort of stuff led to the emergence of Hitler was because of PR. But it wasn't. Not only PR. One of the other major fault lines of German politics in between the wars was the fact that the Bundestag was using majority voting. And you had the situation where there's a majority against this and a majority against that and a majority against him and a majority against the other one. And eventually Hitler came to power. And so when they were rewriting the German constitution in 1944, 45 to 49, that they decided to adopt this MMP, the multi-member proportional, which is half PRSTV and half first past the post, the system that New Zealand has also adopted now. But they did not change the majority voting. And so your Bundestag still takes decisions on a yes or no basis. And it's as I say, this majority voting it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And another interesting story, if I may, it just applies to the United States, because George Washington and others at the beginning were totally opposed to the party system of politics. But Jefferson actually invented a system of PR, and they looked at electoral systems in quite some detail, but they did not question decision making. And this fault line seems to be absolutely everywhere, that people think that majority voting is okay, and electoral systems can vary, but decision making, no, apparently that doesn't vary at all. It has to be by majority vote. And it's a cause of such great suffering in so many places.
A question again about majority voting, which clearly we've talked about, and also proportional representation. And just Rosalind Kent asking what the most significant differences between the two are. I mean, are there, for instance, any circumstances in which you think that majority voting might be an appropriate way of deciding things?
Yes, if the matter is not controversial. So should we now have a coffee break or whatever? If it's non-controversial, yeah, by all means, take a majority vote. That's perfectly okay. But if there is controversy, if there is disagreement, if a sizable minority objects to the very idea of a majority vote, like the nationalists in Northern Ireland in 1973, or those other instances that I mentioned, a sizable number objecting to a majority vote, then okay, go for the multi-option process. Okay.
An interesting question here from someone who's anonymous, and that is it possible to combine what you've been describing in terms of different voting systems with psychological theory, which will assess when significant numbers of people will be triggered to violence and bloodshed, and thus assess which decisions would do the greatest harm?
Wow.
Maybe slightly outside the scope of your book, I don't know, but
no, not quite. Actually, what I do is with the modified border count, it is actually a voting procedure which encourages the voters to cast all their preferences. So if you had a 5-option debate, as New Zealand did a few years ago, then it encouraged, if they had used the modified border count, then if somebody casts only one preference, then okay, that option gets 1 point. And if they say nothing about the other options, then those other options get nothing. And if somebody else votes for 2 preferences, then her first preference gets 2 points, and then her second preference gets 1 point. And so on. So if anybody wants to get the full 5 points for their favorite, then they should cast votes for all their preferences. And this system is encouraging full participation in the democratic process. And it really is, democracy is meant to be for everybody. Initially, it wasn't meant to be a question of winners and losers. It was a way that you come to a collective decision. And if you look at the modified border count, it identifies the option with the highest average preference. And words like majority and minority can fade from the political lexicon. And I think it's going to herald, or it could herald, a new era of cooperation which in these days of COVID and climate change is what we need anyway, desperately. So the psychological thing of majority voting does divide. And we've seen this in so many instances. And it's if you have only the binary choice, like in the United States, for example, and the United States is now in a very dangerous situation because, well, there are so many guns around, but they have divided the nation into two. And then Trump is trying to divide the Republicans into two as well. And it's so dangerous. Whereas if you have this consensual voting, consensus voting, then it encourages a completely different milieu. And I think it overcomes those psychological problems that the questioner was raising.
Thank you. Marisha has asked a question about MTV, multi-transferable voting. What is that? Do you know?
No.
Okay, well, maybe Marisha can provide some clarity whether that's another voting system, and maybe it appears in the document that's on the being circulated in the chat, setting out different voting systems. Okay, another question from Marisha around reducing inequalities. So I suppose, I mean, is there a voting system which you think is more effective at reducing race inequality, for instance? I mean, it can secure outcomes that are more representative, less divisive. I'm not.
Yes, certainly. Just referring to electoral systems, it is generally recognized that PR systems are better for a gender balance, as opposed to majoritarian, first past the post or whatever. And in the same way in decision making, if you have preferential decision making, as in the modified border count, then it is much more cohesive. It is not divisive at all, actually. And it allows everybody, regardless of ethnicity or whatever, it is much more inclusive.
Okay. A question from Mark Kieran, which is one that I was also wondering about, and that is, I mean, clearly you are fully committed to this as an alternative to the present binary voting system. What circumstances, what are the circumstances in which you think the UK population, for instance, would be happy to run with this as an alternative? Is it perhaps when there is volatile times like now, for instance, when people may be after change, or is it in fact at a point where things are quite stable and people feel comfortable and willing to flirt with a new approach? I mean, how do you think this could actually happen, and in what circumstances?
If we take the example of electoral reform, which is certainly a topic which is still on the agenda, of course, and I think we should accept the fact that the 2011 referendum, which offered us first past the post or the alternative vote, but neither of which is PR, of course. So for anybody who is a PR supporter, that was a bit like asking a vegetarian, would you like beef or lamb? A total nonsense. And everybody I've spoken to sort of understands that, apart from the Electoral Commission for some reason.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Oh, because I've argued with them. And in 2011, I argued with them at length, and saying that the 2011 referendum should be multi-optional. And I said that before the election, before the referendum. And I also said the same on Brexit. In February 2016, I issued a press release saying this is a multi-option question and it should be a multi-option vote. But again, the Electoral Commission dismissed me as being dismissible. And yeah, electoral reform is certainly necessary in the UK at the moment. And I think it's something that should be resolved in a multi-option process. In this similar way, perhaps, to the way New Zealand did things, so that we can have the education process that is necessary beforehand, but then allow people to have a choice, a proper choice of about 5 options. And if the system were preferential, it would be even better.
So you don't think that there's an interesting book by Linda Coley, who's looked at constitutions, and I think one of the main conclusions of her book is that you need to get a new written constitution. It normally comes on the back of a war. So you don't think that we need any major upheaval for the sort of system that you're advocating to be implemented?
Well, the UK, of course, one of the few countries that doesn't have a constitution, and I think it'd be nice if it did. But one of the things that is also true to say is that there should be a choice of constitution, and it shouldn't just be up to some academic or group of academics to produce something on which we then say, we the public then say yes or no. And if there were a real choice, and you can do things like this or like that or whatever, and the electoral system can be like this or that, or and decision making in Parliament can be more, and the House of Lords could be, again, you can have varieties, and lots of things could be open to multi-option choices. But that's not to say that multi-option voting cannot be introduced into our decision making today. And one other thing that I would like to suggest is that we should admit that the Brexit vote was not very clever. And that was something where we had an education process after the referendum, not before. And if we'd had it beforehand, maybe we could have avoided those 4 years of bitter argument. And I've even suggested that if the referendum in 2016 had been multi-optional, then Joe Cox would still be alive.
Okay, a quick fire question. Do you have any recommended reading on German electoral policy from Lucian Davies-Jones?
Oh, no, I can't answer that one. I have read the Basic Law, which comes out with this extraordinary statement about the need for majority voting. But I've read a few books on German politics, and I've actually run courses on consensus politics in Potsdam University. And I also did a webinar in Munich, last year, just after the German election, advocating the matrix vote, which is how you could elect, how Parliament, not the people elect the Parliament, and then the Parliament elects an all-party power-sharing executive, a government. And at the moment in British politics, we have this extraordinary situation where the Prime Minister can choose her Praetorian Guard or cabinet, or call it what you like. But she does it by herself, and total power, and it is just so wrong and so undemocratic. And it's what Lord Hailsham called the elected dictatorship. Whereas the matrix vote could resolve this problem, and it could also mean that you have an election for a new parliament, and then 1 week later you have the election in parliament for the cabinet, and there's no need for Belgium or the Netherlands or Ireland or Germany to spend days, weeks, or even months, or sometimes years sorting out a new government. It all be done in a week, with electronic voting as well. Why not?
Okay, we're going to try to cover all the questions. We've got quite a lot to get through. A question from Michael Sinclair, which touches on the question of citizens' assemblies, and do you have a view about whether a citizens' assembly could be something, for instance, that might replace the House of Lords? Is it something that could, in fact, be an addition to the House of Lords, so a third chamber? How would you see citizens' assemblies working within a sort of parliamentary setup?
In a very similar way to how it's done in Ireland, actually. And the Irish system means that the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, then sets up a citizens' assembly and asks the citizens' assembly to look at the question of abortion or whatever it happens to be. And that citizens' assembly, yeah, you then draw your folks by lot and off it goes. And in the Irish situation, the citizens' assembly then makes recommendations to the Irish Parliament, and then, well, it sometimes goes to a referendum or whatever. And yeah, it's worked fairly well, and I think it could work even better if it was done on more multi-option decision-making within the assembly, and then multi-option voting afterwards, by whether it's done by the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, or by the people in a multi-option referendum.
I mean, do you think there are circumstances in which a citizens' assembly should be a standing citizens' assembly? In other words, feeds into all of the legislation that's going through parliaments?
I'd be quite happy with the idea of a permanent citizens' assembly. I think it should probably concentrate on just a few matters, and a few contentious matters, the more important matters, perhaps, as has happened in Ireland. And I don't think it should replace Parliament, and I don't think it should have the authority over Parliament. I mean, the ultimate authority is the people, and whether that's by an election or a referendum or whatever, then that is fine. And the Citizens' Assembly is okay, it's done by lot and all that sort of stuff, but even so, it should still be subject to the final decision-making process of an old democratic process.
Okay, Paul Inskip has asked a question, which is, in effect, is there a country or a couple of countries around the world that you look at and think, if only we had their approach to voting, we would be much better for it?
There are, well, in Northern Ireland's case, the electoral system that we have in Northern Ireland is, as you know, it's PRSTV, and as I say, it does work fairly well, but it only allows the voter to cross the party divide. It doesn't actually encourage them to do so. And in other places, like in Lebanon, and they were given first past the post initially, but then in 1943 they had the type accord, and they decided to change it slightly so that if you had a constituency where it was, let us say, 50% Maronite and 25% Shia and 25% Sunni, then they decided that they should have either four, or if it's a very large constituency, 8 or a multiple of 4 candidates being elected. And every party nominating candidates should nominate in that ratio of 2-1-1, 2 Maronite, 1 Shia and 1 Sunni. So every party becomes non-sectarian. Oh, what a lovely idea. And then another nice idea was in Dagestan, where they decided that, again, they had a bit of a problem with the different religions of Sunni and Shia and so on. So they decided that, well, in this constituency, everybody will be Sunni. And in that constituency, everybody will be Shia. So again, it was to take religion out of politics. That was the idea. So there have been some brave attempts, but they're all attempts at rigging it slightly, I suppose. Whereas the quota border system, the system we mentioned a few moments ago, I think that would do it on a much nicer way of just encouraging people to cross the party divide.
Okay, thank you. Mark had a question, which was, do PR voting systems do away with the inclination that people have to vote tactically, or are there circumstances in which it is still possible to vote tactically under, or necessary perhaps to vote tactically under a PR system?
PRSTV, as we see from Northern Ireland, is, as I say, it's not the best. And what tends to happen over here is that many people will vote for their favorite party, 1, 2, 3, and just not bother with voting for other parties at all. And that happens on both sides of the sectarian divide, Sinn Féin and DUP. So, and also it means when you have the situation with PRSTV, so if it's a 6-seater or a 5-seater, then you just need sort of a little bit under 15% or so, and you're bound to get in. So if you know you have 15% support, then you can, you don't have to do very much. Or you can even be sort of not very nice and make sort of rebel-rousing noises about the other side and increase the sense of division, which has happened in Northern Ireland. PRSTV is a good, as I say, it is very good. It's much better than first past the post, but it doesn't solve all our problems like a magic wand. And with first past the post, which we still have in Northern Ireland for Westminster elections, then you have the crazy situation where, I think this is going back to the earlier days of the Troubles, when of the 12 MPs, 11 of them were unionists, and it was most unproportional, and it was part of the problem. It was just exacerbating the divisiveness of the whole situation. So yeah, PRSTV was a great introduction, but it not the best, and it helps enormously, but again, it doesn't solve every problem.
Marisha Ray has helpfully answered the question about MTV herself. So if people want to go in the Q&A, you'll see the answer to the question. But MTV is a system that you rank all the preferences just like STV and count and eliminate the least popular first, and then you count again with that elimination in place. But she says that it took a whole evening to count just 38 voters and 8 places to fill with 9 choices. So certainly if that was used more widely, I think that might present some problems for returning officers around the country. A quick answer from me, what is the Linda Coley book? So it's the Gun, the Ship, the Pen, and I think I've got those in the right order. And an excellent book it is too. Let's see, what other questions have we got here? Okay, right. So a question from Colin, which is perhaps a worked example of what you've been talking about for decision making. For instance, when passing a national budget, how would non-first past the post or majority voting work? Would there be multiple options, but wouldn't that be impractical, requiring too much technical work, e.g. by the Office of Budget Responsibility?
If you had, let us say, 6 parties in Parliament, which if we had PR of any sort, we would probably get about 6. So you would allow every party to come up with one suggestion. So, okay, the Chancellor can produce his idea and hopefully not by himself, but with some assistance from the rest of his party. And other parties can suggest their ideas. So you have alternative budgets. So you have the Parliament, and the Chancellor can propose his budget, and then the other shadow chancellors can propose their budgets, and you have 6 budgets on the table. And you then have a discussion, and while the discussion is taking place, you use electronic displays and things, and you show the preferences. Each party can show the preferences with which it regards the other options. so that you can tell during the debate where perhaps the consensus lies. And maybe you don't have to have a vote at all, but it's probably a good idea to have a vote at the end of everything, just to confirm. But when you have majority voting, what tends to happen is that people hold their cards close to their chest and they don't reveal their second preferences, because, as was said famously once you've revealed your second preference, you've already lost your first preference. But with preferential voting, you can reveal your second preference and your first preference remains as your first preference. And it remains, undiluted and whatever. So you allow for this process to take place, and you have suggestions, and during the debate, maybe two parties might decide to form a composite. Maybe it gets to the stage where everybody agrees that one of the budgets is no good at all and can be deleted. But none of the changes that take place during the debate will take place if the original proposer of the said motion or motions says objects. So you might start with 6 options on the table and you might finish with 6 options on the table. But then if that's the way it is, okay, and then you have your preferential vote on all 6 options, and the vote, of course, should be unwhipped. I think that goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway.
Okay, I think we've got time for one final question from Gabriel. Now, I might have been maybe focusing on asking the questions rather than listening to your answers, but his question is, and presumably this came up in your response, how can we use voting systems where the second preference chosen can disadvantage the first? If you have a points system, then if something is the second preference of many, lots and lots of people, but the first preference of only 1 or 2, maybe, it can still be regarded as having more popularity than the one which has more first preferences. As in the example that I showed you, the 14 voters, and the 5 people voting for W, they were the largest minority, but they were a minority, and lots of others, 9 of them, a majority of 9, thought that W was the worst option on offer. So to have allowed W to have been the answer would have been, I think, unfair. That's probably where we have to finish, Peter. So I'm afraid there were still a few questions that were not, didn't have time to put to you. But would you like to just say a few closing remarks before we conclude the evening? I need to say thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me and for hosting the event. And I would like to emphasize the fact that when we are talking about voting, to remember that there are both electoral systems and decision-making systems. And while a system can be used in both roles, some of them, it is still necessary to distinguish between the two. And we must get to the stage where, as a society, we start looking at decision-making. Thank you very much, Peter. And Grace has reminded people that your book is available and can be bought by ebook and so on. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this evening, and we look forward to perhaps talking with you again, Peter, and this will be put onto the Unlock Democracy's website so that people can catch up with it later. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, and good night. Good night.